Now, regarding prioritizing norms in a performance context, it might be illuminating to look at a specific performance context, namely that of a composition-based performance. And in a composition-based performance, at the outset, we have the musicians basing their performance on either a score or a model performance. And when I say model performance, I mean a performance that, simply a performance that the musician uses as a reference for the performance that he or she is constructing. And this is mostly relevant in situations, or this is relevant in situations where the musician does not have access to a score. So if we do have access to a score, then we may, of course, also consult specific performances in shaping our performance, but then we're talking about performances that we consider exemplary in this or that situation. So the notion of model performance simply means it's a performance that we use as we would have used a score if we had it. So in a score or model performance, we can say that we have a list of rules, but that are inherent in the score, or that we distill from the score model performance. But these rules are not identical with the composition in itself. And the reason why they are not identical is that we may talk about different arrangements of the same composition, for instance, or different interpretations of the same composition, where we have traits that simply are not part of the original scored composition, or may even omit features that are inherent in the original composition. But we still speak about different arrangements, different versions, and so on of the same composition. So it seems that in a given context, or in a given culture or group context, there is a conventional or subjective view of which rules constitute the composition, which of these rules in the score or model performance constitute the composition. So we have a core of these rules that we would call the composition. But the circuit doesn't end here. Because we do not, musicians do not just regard the rules of the composition as rules pure and simple, rules that we have to follow no matter what. They regard them as prioritized. So some of them are more important than others. And because I'm talking about such a ranking as an interpretation process, one may note here that I've added an extra rule here in the interpretation list that I haven't got in either the score or the composition, just to say that we might imagine an interpretation where the musician adds a feature to the performance that is not reflective of the composition. And this new feature or rule that the musician follows in the performance then has a ranking in relation to the other rules of the composition. And of course, there's a difference between scores and model performances here, because a score is typically much more thin with properties, to quote lots of music philosophers, both Stephen Davies, Theodor Korejcik, and others. The score is thinner with properties than the performance. The performance has lots of properties, and therefore, if we're basing a performance on a model performance, we have more rules to distill, or rather, the distillation process is more. We have more rules to distill from than we have if we are building the performance on a score. So, although this schema is relativized to a composition-based context, I think that genre conventions may actually also probably be a subject of prioritization to the performing musicians. That is, in an improvising situation of improvisation, we may imagine that a jazz musician also gives different priority to different norms, more general norms of the genre. But that is a discussion I won't have time to go into here. Now, we have been talking a lot about norms and rules in their own respect, but how about the intentions that a musician may have for a performance? Because we have some motivation as musicians before we start out performing a piece. what about the musician's motivations for engaging in this performance activity in the first place? Well, we can discuss one aspect of how performance intentions are important by looking at the interplay between intentions, strategies, and norms. And this gets me into a slightly more formal discussion, but I'll try to explain these things informally nevertheless. At the outset, that is, at the beginning of the performance, a musician has a strategy for this performance, that is, an idea of how this strategy may fit into a strategy profile for the entire ensemble with a possible sonic or aesthetic outcome that he or she wants and that he or she intends. And by strategy profile, I mean a collection of strategies, one for each other player. So I have, as a musician, I have a goal that I want, or a set of goals that I would like to achieve. So I try to find a global strategy, you could also say that, a collection of strategies for all of the, for every member of the ensemble that would result in this outcome, and then I try to play my own part in this strategy profile in order to, in the hope that we would realize this outcome. Unfortunately, it often goes that way that the musicians have not chosen to follow the same strategy profile. And so a musician may often have to stop and try to mine for a new strategy in a different strategy profile that also has one of the outcomes that he or she intends for the performance. And this choice of strategy profile and the recognition of other musicians' possible choices of strategy profile in the situation are delimited by the number of possible strategy profiles the performance context allows. That is, in the performance context, we have rules that are more or less explicit, that determine what we can choose to, which sorts of strategies we can choose to pursue in the situation. And in fact, this is a lot like if we have a board game, for instance. We have a set of rules that we need to follow in order to be playing the board game, but that doesn't mean that every action that we take in the board game is determined by the rules. The rules simply set up a frame for what we can do in that situation. And similarly, if we have a performance context, then the rules of the performance context, whether it be the rules of the composition or the genre conventions, set up, we can say, a field of possibilities that we can choose in the situation. But, in short and informally, if the musicians did not conceive of any rules for the performance context, the individual musician would not be able to A, make any choices initially. That is, if we didn't have any rules or we didn't have a strategy for what we wanted to do, then we wouldn't be able to get going at all. Wouldn't be able to B, categorize mistakes, because categorizing mistakes is dependent on the rules for that given performance context, because these rules determine what are mistakes and what are not mistakes. And C, the musician will not be able to delimit the number of possible interpretations to expect from the other musicians, simply because everything would be possible if there weren't any rules determining or delimiting the number of possible interpretations one could expect. Well, then anything would be possible, and would be impossible to mine for a strategy that would ensure coordination. In short, or in other words, the musicians would not be able to solve coordination problems by will. So intentions, although intentions are important and necessary in a performance in order to get going, they only work in tandem with norms still. And by intentions for performance, I'm talking about very broadly about intentions. An intention can be very minimal, as for instance, it could be simply getting through the piece, that's an intention. Or it could be more grand, such as realizing a certain grand or artistic vision in the performance. But the musician always has some intention for the performance, no matter how minimal or how great. So these discussions I have tried to, in my dissertation, tried to formalize in terms of different modeling schemes. The role of expectations for other players' actions can be modeled in terms of game theory. For example, the game theory with variable frames that we find in Michael Bacharach's book, Beyond Individual Choice, from 2006. And we have the interplay between intentions, strategies, and assumptions regarding other musician strategies that we could model in terms, or I'm trying to model this in terms of a variant of dynamic epistemic logic. And the version that I use is very dependent on the work of Olivier Roy in his work Reasoning About Intentions from 2008. I may have gotten the title a bit wrong here. Sorry. I should perhaps mention for those interested that I also employ classical epistemic logic in a description of how coordination in an ensemble can be ensured by common knowledge of a set of rules. But this is a discussion that I will, a subordinate aspect that I will not have time to go into here. So I'll spare you from now. For now. So, the main idea that I wanted to highlight in my dissertation is this: that we cannot do without norms in interpersonal relations. Whether rules are specific to the character of the situation, whether they are rules stemming from my goals, or from general values, or from tradition, or whether I follow them automatically, as I do when they're internalized, or after careful consideration, as when I have to make a choice. All of these rules and norms play a part in the formation of my choices and in reaching coordination with the people around me. And I've tried to show this in terms of the coordination processes in a music ensemble. And one of the reasons why I've chosen, there are several reasons why I've chosen the music ensemble or music performance as an example. One of them is, of course, the pragmatic, that I've been playing music for many years myself. But I've also been very fascinated by the dedication that a musician can have to seemingly arbitrary rules in the situation. The musician follows rules that are part of a performance context that the musician has willingly put him or herself in. But instead of just thinking, well, today these are the rules that I'm following today, and tomorrow I'll be following something else, and it can all just be equally important. The musician shows a lot of dedication to actually following the rules of the performance context. A dedication that I think is really interesting, and it's also interesting to see why. See the merit of this dedication in reaching coordination with the other musicians. Because in the situation where the musicians are, or in the scenario I was describing in terms of intention, the musicians have to stay dedicated to the intention that they have in the situation. If they do not, if they throw their intentions away too fast, it will not be able for the other musicians to gradually find out what their intentions are, or gradually try to agree with them on a strategy. So this is my project in a very short version. And if anyone wants to read the entire dissertation, you can find it at my website. There's a link at the front page. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to discuss this with your opponents.